Hi, so a couple of weeks ago I made a video on the basics of Cubase automation, and I also asked the question whether you also wanted to see a follow-up video about the more advanced features of Cubase automation. Well, this follow-up video was requested many times by you, so I'm now going to have a look at those more advanced features of Cubase automation. And even though the initial video contained everything that I use, well, most of the time when it comes to Cubase automation, there are some advanced features which can be really useful and can also make the handling of automation in Cubase much more efficient. So let's go. Okay, so most of the advanced features of Cubase automation can be accessed by opening the automation panel in Cubase. Let's have a look. So you can open the automation panel by going to Project, Automation Panel, or pushing F6. And this opens up the automation panel, which has two tabs. First tab is called Operations and the second tab is called Settings. And on the top left you have the global controls for automation, being Activate Read Automation for all tracks, Activate Write Automation for all tracks, and also to suspend all read and write automation on all tracks. And as you can see, those are actually the same controls as that you have on top here in your toolbar, if you have enabled that part of the toolbar in the Setup toolbar menu on the right. Now you see that there's actually a third automation control over here, allowing you to switch automation modes, which I'll get to in a minute. But you can also switch this to the other automation modes, which doubles with the switch that you can do over here to switch automation modes. Now the automation toolbar over here also contains the E button, which opens and closes the automation panel itself. And it also contains a button to let the automation follow events or not. And that's a feature that I explained in the basic video. So if you haven't seen that yet, check it out. Now as for the automation panel, you may notice that when I suspend all automation, that at the same time in these two columns, all buttons light up. And that's because in these columns, you also have the option to suspend certain parameters for reading automation and certain other parameters for writing automation. So you can also suspend read and write individually. For example, you may want to suspend all reading of automation data for volume automation, or maybe for sense automation. And maybe you want to disable writing automation for volume as well and for mutes. So on this first track, you can, for example, see that the volume automation reading has been disabled because I enabled the suspending of reading of volume. If I click this again, you see that the volume automation is enabled again and disabled. Now, if I unsuspend everything again, you can see that there's also a fourth column, which provides a very nice way to show certain automation. You can hide all automation in your project. So right now the automation tracks are gone. You still see a little bit of automation here because it's on the main Hall effect track, but you don't see any actual automation tracks anymore. You can also, for example, enable all pan automation tracks on all channels. So you can see that almost none of these actually contain automation data except for the panning of the keys main audio channel. And you can click hide all again to get rid of them again. Now, if you only wanted to see the panning automation tracks which are actually used, so which contain automation data, you can enable used only in this column. And now if I click pan, you see that only the keys main automation track opens up because there's actual automation data on there. And you also have the option to show all used automation tracks by clicking the show use button over here. And now all automation tracks that contain any automation are opened up so that you can have a look. But let's close all the automation tracks again and let's simplify even further by only showing the automation on this track, which is volume. Because one of the central things to understand when you're dealing with automation modes and some of the other features in the automation panel is the concept of an automation pass. For example, when you enable write automation on a track, like this, that doesn't mean it has already started recording automation data. Because there's actually a moment of punching in the writing and punching out the writing. And that's very similar to how this works for audio recording. You can enable recording in Cubase, but it will only start recording audio when you punch in that audio recording, and it will stop recording audio when you punch out. Now there's various ways in Cubase in which you can punch in and punch out an audio recording, and the same goes for automation data. Let's have a look at an example. If I start over here and I start playback, currently no automation is being written because the values over here stay the same. However, when I move the fader, you can see that it starts recording automation data. And when I let go of the fader, you can see that automation data is no longer recorded. So when I grabbed the fader with my mouse and started moving it, that was the punch-in point of recording automation. And when I let go of the fader, that was the punch-out point of recording the automation. And the period in between is what the Cubase manual calls the automation pass. So why is this important, you may wonder? Well, that's because the automation modes that I'm going to show you actually determine the punch-out point of the automation writing. So let's have a look. So in the automation panel, these are the 3 automation modes: touch, auto-latch and crossover. And in all modes, automation data is written as soon as a parameter control is touched when you play. So for example, when I touch the fader here for the volume automation track. But these modes differ with regard to when and how they do the punch out. Now there are some general events in which all 3 automation modes punch out. And that's when you disable the write button, when you stop playback, when you activate fast forward or rewind, when the project cursor reaches the write locator when you're in cycle mode, or when you click in the ruler to move the project cursor. But this is actually something that you can configure. If you go to the settings, you can also enable over here that you want to continue writing on transport jump. So then you can move your project cursor while you're writing automation, and that will continue your automation pass. Cubase will not punch out basically. But let's set that to the default again. Now the first automation mode, touch, is very useful when you want to make a change that only lasts for a few seconds and not change any of the other automation data. For example, let's say that we wanted to automate the volume down a little bit in this section, which is now straight, but we do not want to touch any of the other automation data. So the behavior of touch is that it starts writing as soon as I touch the volume fader, and it'll stop writing as soon as I let go of the volume fader, and then the automation will return to the current value. Let's see how that works. Let's press play. And now I'm starting to move this, moving it down. I let go and you see that the automation immediately returns to the value that was at that cursor location before. So it jumps back to the previous value. It doesn't stay at the value that I moved the fader to, for example. Now you can actually influence how quick the automation data returns to the previous value by looking at the settings over here, and that's the return time. So right now this jump actually takes 33 milliseconds, which is rather fast. If we zoom in, you can see more clearly that the jump is not immediate, but there's actually a certain time it takes in which the automation is returned to the previous value. So let's undo this change and move to the next automation mode, which is Auto-latch. And this automation mode is useful to maintain a value over a longer period of time, for example, when making EQ settings for a particular scene, as shown in this example of the Cubase manual. So basically, punch in happens again when I start moving the control, but even after I let go of the control, it will still keep writing automation data until I punch out in some other way. So letting go of the control does not end the automation pass this time. So let's start play. I move the fader down. It's writing automation. I let go of the fader and it's still writing automation, overwriting any of the other values. And if I now click stop, there's a punch out. And then after that, the existing automation values stay in place. And again, you can see that that change is not immediate, but it's based on the set return time in the settings. Now, if you wanted to punch out in this mode, but still keep playing the project, it's also possible to just click the right automation button or to use a key command in the automation category, which is punch out of latch automation. You could set up a key command for that. I currently haven't. But if you then use that button, you can also punch out that way out of this automation mode and still keep playing the project. So let's undo this again and move on to the last automation mode, which is called crossover. And this means again that you can punch in by moving any of the parameters and controls that you want to automate. If you then let go of that control, it will keep writing automation at the last level, like in auto-latch mode. And if you then grab the control again and move it back to its original value, punch out occurs automatically as soon as you cross that original value. For example, let's start playback. I'm moving down the fader. I've let go of the fader. Now I move the fader back. And you see that it automatically punched out when I reached this level over here. So in this way, I can finally control the start of the automation curve, but I can also finally control the end of the automation curve that I'm adding. Now I've just shown you the automation writing by using the controls with mouse and keyboard, but obviously if you have a hardware controller that's even more convenient, and then you can use these automation points to finally determine when the automation punches in and punches out for writing. Now before we move on to the trimming of automation, if you like this video or find it useful, please give it a thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm, it really helps. Subscribe to the channel and ring the little bell icon if you want to get notified when I post another video. And in case you want to buy anything musical at these stores, if you do so via the affiliate links, I get a small percentage of your purchase without it costing anything extra to you. But now on to trimming of automation data in Cubase. Now automation trim in Cubase allows you to change the automation data on an automation track without actually editing all the individual values of the automation events. Because sometimes you have nicely automated the volume of a track, for example, but towards the end of the project you actually discover that you wanted all values to be slightly higher, maybe half a dB extra or something like that. And automation trim is a way to do that, because for example this is the volume automation of this track. Now imagine that I wanted to add half a dB extra for all these values. What you can do of course is do this, select all of them and then set this value to -6, and then all values are half a dB louder. But another way to do this is by using the trimming of automation. And you can enable trim in the automation panel by clicking trim and pushing the right button over here. So you see that you now get a trim curve and the default value is 0. But if you now wanted to add a certain value to all automation data on this track, you can just edit this trim value. And you can see that the automation track is entirely moved up. You can also move down, of course, and then you can also see that it's relative. So the automation data is actually compressed when you get to the really low values, and it's expanded when you get to really high values. If you turn off trim, you see that you still see the original automation data, but when Cubase plays your project, the actual data that is used is the automation data plus the trim value. And by the way, trim only works for channel volume and Q send levels. It does not work for all automation parameters. Now, if I undo this for a second, I can show you that this also works for much more elaborate curves. For example, if I turn on trim again, I can also add trim values like this. And you see that the resulting automation curve gets adjusted accordingly. Or I can even just write automation data with my control here. And you can see that currently you're not actually writing automation data for the volume, but you're writing automation data for the trim of the volume. So you're keeping all of the original automation events, but you're just specifying a delta for the final automation value, if that makes sense. Now it does get a bit complex, of course, but maybe if we undo this, it makes more sense, for example, if you wanted to maybe increase the volume automation just for the chorus. Imagine that this is the chorus. You can now edit the trim value. So the chorus will just be higher in volume, maintaining all the slight differences that you automated already. Now, if you're happy with the final resulting automation curve, you can also freeze the trim value. And you can do that over here. You can say freeze trim automation of selected tracks. And now the trim value is set to 0 again, as you can see over here. And the actual automation data has been adjusted according to the trim that you specified earlier. In settings, it is also possible to configure when you want to freeze the trim data, because I just showed you that I did it manually long after I actually added the trim data, but it's also possible to say, well, immediately when my automation pass ends, I want to freeze the trim data. So then it basically happens right away. Or it's also possible to specify that you want to freeze the trim when you disable the trim mode. So for example, when you disable this button, it automatically freezes the trim value and merges it with the original automation data. So this gives you a lot of flexibility in changing the automation data without having to edit the automation values in detail yourself. Now, so far we've seen that when you enable automation on a track, there is automation data on the whole length of the track. Let's have a look at that. For example, on this new test track in blue, if I add an automation track for volume, you can see that there is already a default value here, which is determined by the position of the fader. So let's set the fader to -1, for example. And if I enable read on this track, then through the whole length of the song, the fader will be forced to value -1, unless I add other automation data, of course. However, there's also a way in which you can avoid that, and that's by using the version territories. That's a setting in the automation panel. You can say use version territories, and then you can see that the default value actually disappears. And when you now write automation data, you can see that automation data only appears where you actually write it and not in between. So there are now gaps in the automation data. And if we now turn off write, and for example, when we start play over here, we can set the fader wherever we want. Then the automation is applied. Another automation, manual change, automation. And then from here on, I can do what I want again with the fader and it will stay where I left it. So in this way, it's possible to only automate certain sections of the track and not force any automation for the rest of the track. Now in the automation panel, you can fill those gaps again. For example, it says over here, fill gaps on selected tracks. So now it has just filled the in-between values with an automation curve. Or if I undo this, you can also say fill gaps with current value. So the current value of the fader is minus 10.2. So if I select that, all gaps will be filled with value minus 10.2. Now it's also possible to get new gaps again. You can, for example, select this range, push backspace or delete, and you have a new gap. And the automation values at the edges are remembered by a new automation event. Now it's also possible to introduce gaps by setting certain automation events as terminator. I've now selected this automation event, and in the info line you can see that it says terminator no. If I select terminator yes, then the automation curve between this automation event and the next one is removed and I have a gap again in which there is no automation data. So these virgin territories could, for example, be useful if you want to do your whole automation manually during a whole pass of the song, but still have certain sections where there is pre-programmed automation data. Now let's disable the virgin territories again over here, because there's one column here that I didn't discuss yet, and that's the fill column. If I get rid of this automation data, you see that we're back to a single automation value because I disabled virgin territories. And these fill options over here, they determine what happens in a specific section of the project when you punch out of a running automation pass. And each fill option writes a specific value across a certain section of your automation track. For example, if you enable fill to punch, what happens is that if we write automation and go look for the right volume level of this track, and now punch out, you saw that all automation events are actually removed and the whole automation section is filled with the value that was recorded at the punch out point. So this is actually fill from punch out to punch in. That's why it's called fill to punch in point. If you undo this, you also have a fill to start. And if we remove this automation point and add some automation data, I'm looking for the right volume level, and when I release, the whole section from the start of the project to the punch out point is filled with the same value, with the value that was recorded at the moment of punch out. Now you have a similar thing where you can fill to the end of the project. Let's manually add some automation data here first. And if I now say to end and start recording automation here, go look for the right volume level. If I let go, everything from the punch out point towards the end of the project is filled with the value that was recorded at punch out. Fill loop is yet another option. If we set a loop here, for example, with the left and right locator, and we start recording automation data, you can see that the whole loop basically gets filled with the value that was recorded at punch out. Now back to a situation in which we have gaps. If I say fill gaps, then I can again start writing automation data. You will see that the gaps will be filled at the moment of punch out as well. Yeah, so another way to fill the gaps while you're writing automation. Now these fill buttons, you saw that when I pushed them, then the next automation pass would apply the fill option and then it would get disabled. If you want to continuously enable such a fill option, you need to double click it and then it will get locked. And this means that it will stay enabled and every automation pass will cause the effect that's indicated by the fill option. So now we've covered most of the options in the automation panel except for a few in the settings. So let's have a look at those. One very useful one is show data on tracks. So that means that if you have automation on a track, for example, I know I have volume automation on this track, and you want to make sure that the automation data aligns exactly with your waveform, you can also show the waveform on the track to make that more easy. Now virgin territories we discussed, continue writing on transport jump as well. Reveal parameter on write basically means that as soon as you add automation data by moving a certain control in Cubase or on your hardware surface, that it will also be displayed in the project view. It will basically open the automation track after you've done your automation pass. Return time we discussed. Reduction level, that's also very useful because like you see over here, there are a lot of automation events very close to each other. And if I record some new automation data here, for example, like this, you see that there's a lot of automation events very close to each other. Now, if I change the setting to set the reduction level to, for example, 50%, Cubase will reduce the number of automation events that are put into the automation track. For example, if I now start writing automation data again, you can see that the number of automation events are now significantly reduced, even for the automation pass that I already did on this track. Now, the only thing that we haven't discussed yet is the spike detection range, and that's basically to guard against sudden spikes in your automation data. For example, if you have a hardware controller which is not really reliable and sometimes just generates a very high value for the automation, then you can let Cubase automatically detect that spike and ignore it by setting the length for what you would consider a spike. This can go from 50 milliseconds to, I believe, 200. So if there's then a sudden automation change within that range of 200 milliseconds, Cubase will basically ignore it and just go by all the other automation events which were recorded. Now, that's basically what I wanted to share about advanced automation in Cubase. And if you like these deep dives into Cubase functionality, I have a whole playlist with videos about tempo and time related functionality in Cubase. I'll put it over here. Check it out, enjoy, and see you soon.